July 4th, 1976, New York Harbor. 200 tall ships sail past the Statue of Liberty. 16 warships from 16 nations. 6 million people lining the shores. The largest maritime gathering since the Battle of Navarino in 1827. 5 years of planning. $50 million spent on coordination and security. Another $150 million on local celebrations across the country. And while America threw the biggest birthday party in history, 7.7 million Americans couldn't find work. This is the story of the year. We celebrated a promise we'd already stopped keeping. Here's what the Bicentennial actually cost. Operation Sail alone required 5 years of international coordination. Ships racing from the Canary Islands to Bermuda, then sailing in formation to New York. President Gerald Ford reviewed the parade from the deck of the aircraft carrier Forrestal. 21-gun salute. Television coverage beamed to 90 million households. Washington, D.C. 500,000 people watched a parade down Constitution Avenue. Vice President Rockefeller rode in a bulletproof glass reviewing stand. Philadelphia pitched a World's Fair celebration. Budget, over $1 billion. Expected visitors, 100 million. Every town in America had a parade. Fireworks everywhere. Concerts, festivals, reenactments. And this is where it turns. Because while the government was spending hundreds of millions on tall ships and fireworks, the economy was collapsing. January 1976. Unemployment, 7.9%. That's 7.7 million people out of work, not looking for better jobs, not between careers, unemployed, no income, bills still due. Inflation, 5.8% annually. Everything costs more. Wages aren't keeping up. Savings erode. This combination has a name: stagflation. The economy stalls. Prices rise anyway, and nobody knows how to fix it. By summer 1976, the average American family was earning less buying power than they had in 1973. 3 years of backwards motion while the cost of living climbed. And the government's solution was to throw a party that cost more than most cities' annual budgets. But here's the part they don't talk about. The Bicentennial wasn't about celebration. It was about distraction. 2 years earlier, Richard Nixon resigned in disgrace. Watergate, cover-ups, criminal conspiracy at the highest level of government. Gerald Ford pardoned him. Immediately. No trial. No accountability. Trust in government collapsed. 1964. 73% of Americans trusted the federal government to do the right thing most of the time. 1976. 22%. That's not a decline. That's a collapse of legitimacy. And while that collapse was accelerating, while inflation was eating middle-class savings, while unemployment was destroying families, the government decided America needed tall ships and fireworks. Because if people are watching a parade, they're not asking why their paychecks stopped covering groceries. July 4th, 1976. 6 million people in New York alone, watching ships sail, watching fireworks explode over the harbor. And this is what nobody calculated: the cost to attend. A family of 4 driving into New York City from New Jersey or Connecticut. $10 in gas and 1976 prices. Parking, $15. Food from street vendors, $25 minimum for a day. Total, $50 for 1 day. That's $225 in today's money. For a family earning the median income of $13,000 a year, that's half a week's pay to watch ships. The Bicentennial was advertised as a celebration for all Americans. But half of American families couldn't afford to attend the flagship event without sacrificing necessities. And that gap defines what came next. Because while 6 million people celebrated in New York, 120 million Americans stayed home. Not because they didn't want to participate, because they couldn't afford the day off work, couldn't afford gas, couldn't afford to travel. The celebration was for people who still had enough economic security to take a Sunday and spend it watching ships. For everyone else, July 4th, 1976 was just another day of trying to make the rent. And this is where the promise broke. The Declaration of Independence says all men are created equal. The Bicentennial demonstrated that some could afford to celebrate that equality, and most couldn't. 200 years after the founding, America had created a system where the party itself was segregated by income. But it gets worse. While the fireworks were exploding, American manufacturing was collapsing. Steel mills in Pittsburgh running at 60% capacity, layoffs every month. Auto plants in Detroit losing market share to Japanese imports. Union workers with 20 years seniority getting pink slips. The Rust Belt wasn't a future problem in 1976. It was already happening. And nobody at the Bicentennial celebrations mentioned it. Because you can't talk about permanent job loss during a birthday party. You can't explain that the industrial jobs that built the American middle class are disappearing, while marching bands play patriotic songs. So the government spent $50 million on Operation Sale, and the workers who built the ships that won World War II watched their factories close. This is the pattern that defines 1976. Public celebration masking private collapse. National pride obscuring economic failure. Fireworks louder than the sound of industries dying. And the people who paid for that distraction never got a say in whether the party was worth the cost. The Bicentennial didn't celebrate 200 years of American progress. It celebrated the last moment before everyone realized the progress had stopped. The tall ships sailed into New York Harbor on July 4th, and the middle class started sinking the same day. Nobody connected the two events, but they were the same story. America spending money it didn't have on a vision of itself that no longer existed, while the people who built that vision discovered they'd been left behind. The fireworks were beautiful, and that was the point. Beautiful enough that you wouldn't notice the economy burning down behind them. September 1976. U.S. Steel announces it's closing 14 plants and mills across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Illinois. 13,000 jobs gone. No warning. No transition assistance. No plan for what happens to towns built around those mills. Just gone. And this is the part nobody connected to the Bicentennial celebrations 3 months earlier. While 6 million people watched tall ships sail past the Statue of Liberty, the industrial base that built those kinds of ships was already being dismantled. The fireworks covered the sound of factories closing. Here's what was happening in Pittsburgh in 1976. Steel employment, still close to 300,000 jobs across the metro area. That number wouldn't collapse until the early 1980s. But the cracks were already visible. Mills running at 70% capacity. Foreign steel undercutting domestic prices. Management deferring maintenance on aging equipment. Workers with 25 years seniority could see it coming, but they couldn't stop it. Because the problem wasn't worker productivity or union wages. The problem was that American steel companies had stopped investing in modernization after World War II. They assumed the industrial advantage was permanent. It wasn't, and this is where it turns. 1950, the Rust Belt employed 43% of all American manufacturing workers. 1976, 35%. Still the dominant region. Still the industrial core, but the share was shrinking. And nobody was talking about what happened when it kept shrinking. Because in 1976, manufacturing jobs still paid enough to support a family on one income. Median manufacturing wage, $13,700 a year. That bought a house, a car, healthcare, college savings. You didn't need a degree. You needed to show up, work hard, follow safety rules, and you got a middle-class life. That bargain was breaking in 1976, but most workers didn't know it yet. Here's what the numbers actually showed. 1970 to 1976. American manufacturing lost 275,000 jobs. Not in a crash, not in a panic, slowly. Quarterly layoffs. Plant closures announced 6 months in advance. Attrition through early retirement. Invisible unless it was your job. And this is the part they don't talk about. Those weren't temporary layoffs. They were permanent eliminations. The steel mill in Youngstown, Ohio, that laid off 500 workers in 1974 didn't rehire them when demand recovered. It automated the process with fewer workers. Or it closed the line entirely. The factory in Gary, Indiana that cut 200 jobs in 1975 replaced them with equipment, not people. Manufacturing output kept growing through the 1970s. But employment peaked in 1979 and never recovered. 291,000 manufacturing jobs existed in Pittsburgh in 1979. By 1989, 193,000. 100,000 jobs lost in 10 years. And the only warning sign was those slow, steady layoffs starting in 1976. But here's what made it irreversible. Union membership peaked in 1976 at 27.9% of the workforce. 27.9%. That's 1 in 4 workers with collective bargaining power. And from that peak, it declined every single year for the next 50 years. Because once manufacturing jobs started disappearing, unions lost their leverage. You can't strike for better wages when a company can close the plant and move production overseas. You can't demand job security when foreign competitors are undercutting prices by 30%. The leverage unions had built over 40 years evaporated in less than a decade, and the workers who depended on that leverage discovered they'd been negotiating from a position that no longer existed. This is where the generational divide opens. If you started working in manufacturing in 1960, you retired with a pension, health care, and a house you owned. If you started in 1976, you got laid off in your 40s with no transferable skills and no plan. Same job, same company, different timing. One generation got the full middle-class deal. The next got the rug pulled out halfway through. And the difference was nothing they controlled, just when they were born. September 1976. 13,000 U.S. steel workers lose their jobs. Local newspapers cover it. Union leaders protest. Politicians promise to investigate. Nothing changes. Because this is the pattern that defines 1976. Private collapse hidden behind public celebration. While the nation was focused on the Bicentennial, the economic foundation was cracking. And the people who noticed were told they were being pessimistic during a birthday party. You can't talk about permanent job loss when everyone's singing the national anthem. You can't explain that your factory is dying when the president is reviewing tall ships. So the workers stayed quiet, and the job losses continued. Here's what nobody calculated in 1976. When a steel mill closes, it doesn't just eliminate mill jobs. It eliminates the diner across the street, the hardware store that sold tools to workers, the gas station on the route to the plant, the bar where third shifts stopped after work. One mill employing 2,000 workers supported 6,000 indirect jobs in the surrounding community. Close the mill, and the entire town begins dying, slowly at first. Storefronts empty one at a time. School enrollment drops. Property values collapse. By the mid-1980s, entire towns in Pennsylvania and Ohio became ghost economies. Populations cut in half. Main streets boarded up. Nothing left but people too old or too poor to leave. And it all started with those early layoffs in 1976 that everyone dismissed as temporary adjustments. But here's the moral imbalance. The executives who decided to close those plants kept their jobs. The workers who built the products lost everything. U.S. Steel's CEO in 1976 earned over $700,000 annually. That's $3.7 million in today's money. The workers being laid off earned $13,700. When the plant closed, The CEO got a performance bonus for reducing labor costs. The workers got 6 weeks severance and told to find new careers at age 45 in towns where the only employer just left. One group called it necessary restructuring. The other group called it betrayal. And the system never asked which perspective was correct. It just rewarded the executives and discarded the workers. By December 1976, unemployment in manufacturing-heavy counties was already above 10%. Not nationally, just in the regions where factories were closing. Beaver County, Pennsylvania, 12% unemployment. Mahoning County, Ohio, 11.3%. St. Clair County, Illinois, 10.8%. These weren't abstract statistics. They were towns where 1 in 10 adults who wanted to work couldn't find jobs. And the national unemployment rate of 7.7% masked what was happening in the communities that built America's industrial power. While the rest of the country celebrated the Bicentennial, those towns were already in recession. A recession that would last 40 years. The tall ships sailed away from New York Harbor on July 5, 1976, and the steel mills kept closing. Nobody connected those two events, but they were the same story. America celebrating a vision of itself that was already disappearing. Industrial dominance, middle-class stability, shared prosperity. All of it built on manufacturing jobs that were vanishing while everyone watched fireworks. The workers knew. They'd been seeing the layoff notices for 6 years. But nobody with power to change was listening, because the people making decisions about plant closures didn't live in the towns being destroyed. They lived in suburbs far from the mills, managing spreadsheets that showed labor costs too high and foreign competition too cheap. And when the numbers stopped working, they closed the plants and moved on. The workers didn't get to move on. They got to watch their towns die in slow motion. And the only memorial was a September newspaper article announcing 13,000 more jobs gone. While America was still celebrating its birthday, the future those workers had been promised was already over. They just didn't have a date for the funeral yet. That would come in the 1980s, when the Rust Belt got its name. But the rust started forming in 1976, while everyone was watching tall ships. April 29, 1976. The Church Committee releases its final report, 2,700 pages, 6 volumes. Findings: the CIA conducted illegal domestic surveillance on American citizens, opened 300,000 first-class letters without warrants, infiltrated anti-war groups and civil rights organizations, tested LSD on unwitting Americans in Operation MKUltra, plotted assassinations of foreign leaders. The FBI ran COINTELPRO, domestic counterintelligence programs targeting activists, journalists, and politicians the Bureau considered threats. Break-ins, wiretaps, blackmail, disinformation campaigns. All of it illegal. All of it hidden. All of it sanctioned at the highest levels of government. And 2 months later, America threw a birthday party celebrating freedom and democracy. This is where the disconnect becomes permanent. Here's what people knew in 1976. Richard Nixon resigned in disgrace 2 years earlier. August 9, 1974. First president in history forced out of office. Not for policy disagreements or political differences, for criminal conspiracy, obstruction of justice, abuse of power. The Watergate tapes proved it. Nixon's own voice ordering the CIA to stop the FBI investigation. Cover-ups, hush money, witness tampering. 69 people were charged. 2 cabinet members, multiple White House staff, Nixon's closest advisors. And then Gerald Ford pardoned Nixon, September 8, 1974. 1 month after Nixon resigned. Full pardon, no trial, no admission of guilt, no accountability. Ford's approval rating collapsed overnight, 71% to 49%. And this is where it turns. Because the pardon wasn't mercy. It was a signal. The signal that different rules apply at the top. You can order break-ins. You can obstruct justice. You can corrupt an entire administration. And if you're president, you walk away. No prison, no trial, no consequences. The system protects its own. And everyone watching learned the lesson. Power insulates. Authority shields. The law bends for the people who write it. That lesson destroyed trust faster than any scandal. Because scandals can be explained away. Mistakes can be forgiven. But watching a criminal president receive a pardon while his subordinates went to prison taught Americans something they couldn't unlearn. The game is rigged at the top. But Watergate was just the beginning. The Church Committee spent 19 months investigating the intelligence community. What they found was systematic abuse of power spanning 3 decades. Operation Shamrock. The National Security Agency intercepted every telegram entering or leaving the United States from 1945 to 1975. 30 years of warrantless surveillance of American citizens. Operation Chaos. The CIA spied on 7,000 American citizens involved in anti-war protests, created files, infiltrated groups, collected names. COINTELPRO. The FBI targeted civil rights leaders, anti-war activists, journalists, and politicians. Martin Luther King received anonymous letters urging him to commit suicide. The Black Panthers were infiltrated and destroyed from within. Student groups were monitored and disrupted. None of it was legal. All of it was policy. And this is the part they don't talk about. The Church Committee didn't reveal isolated incidents. It revealed a pattern. For 3 decades, the most powerful agencies in America operated outside the law, targeting American citizens with no oversight and no accountability. And nobody stopped them, because the people who could have stopped them were either complicit or too afraid of what they'd find. Presidents knew. Directors knew. Congressional leaders knew. And they let it continue, because stopping it would have meant admitting the entire system was corrupt. So they kept it hidden until they couldn't anymore. April 1976. The Church Committee report is public. Every detail, every operation, every abuse. And the response from Washington is silence. No criminal charges against CIA directors. No prosecution of FBI officials. No consequences for the architects of illegal surveillance programs. Congress passes the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act 2 years later. Creates a secret court to approve warrants. That's the reform. A court that operates in secret, reviews requests in private, almost never denies a warrant. The surveillance continues. It just gets a legal framework. The abuse doesn't stop. It gets laundered through process. And this is where the moral imbalance becomes permanent. Because here's who went to prison for Watergate. John Mitchell, Attorney General, 19 months. H.R. Haldeman, Chief of Staff, 18 months. John Ehrlichman, Domestic Affairs Advisor, 18 months. Howard Hunt, CIA operative who organized the break-in, 33 months. The subordinates served time. The president walked free. And the institutions that enabled decades of illegal activity faced no consequences at all. The CIA wasn't dismantled. It was reformed. The FBI wasn't prosecuted. It was reorganized. The NSA wasn't shut down. It was given new guidelines. All the people who built careers running illegal operations retired with pensions. All the people who followed orders took the fall. July 4th, 1976. 2 months after the Church Committee report. 6 million people watching tall ships in New York Harbor, celebrating 200 years of constitutional democracy. And this is what nobody wanted to acknowledge. The Constitution had been violated systematically for 30 years by the institutions sworn to protect it. The freedoms being celebrated had been stripped away in secret by agencies operating without oversight. The democracy on display was a performance. The reality was surveillance, infiltration, and abuse. And the Bicentennial was the distraction. You can't have a national conversation about systemic corruption during a birthday party. You can't process betrayal while watching fireworks. So the government threw the biggest celebration in history. And everyone pretended the revelations from April didn't matter anymore. But here's what changed in 1976 that never reversed. Trust in government collapsed. 1964, 73% of Americans trusted the federal government to do the right thing most of the time. 1974, 36%. Post-Watergate, 1976, 22%. That's not a polling fluctuation. That's a civilization-level break in the relationship between citizens and the state. And it never recovered. 1980, 25% trust. 1990, 22%. 2000, 30% briefly after September 11th, then back to 20%. 2026, 18%. For 50 years, trust has stayed below 30%. And it started collapsing in 1976. Not because of Watergate alone, but because the system's response to Watergate proved the corruption was structural. This is what kills democracies, not coups, not invasions, cynicism. When citizens stop believing the system is capable of self-correction, they disengage. They stop voting, stop participating, stop caring. And the people who benefit from that disengagement take over. 1976 was the year Americans learned their government had been lying to them for decades. The CIA, the FBI, the NSA, the White House, all of it corrupt, all of it hidden, all of it forgiven with pardons and reforms that changed nothing. And the only response was fireworks. Because if you throw a big enough party, maybe people will forget. They didn't forget. They just stopped expecting anything different. The Church Committee report was supposed to be a reckoning. Instead, it became evidence that reckonings don't happen. Powerful people don't face consequences. Institutions don't dismantle themselves. Systems don't reform from the inside. The report documented 30 years of crimes, and nobody went to prison who actually mattered. The surveillance continued under new names. The abuses continued with better cover. The corruption continued with legal frameworks. And the trust that was broken in 1976 never came back. Because once you learn the system protects the people who break it, you can't unlearn that. The Bicentennial celebrated 200 years of American democracy. But 1976 was the year most Americans stopped believing that democracy was real. They'd seen the evidence. Watergate, Church Committee, Nixon's pardon. The system was rigged, and the fireworks were just noise to drown out the proof. September 4th, 1974. First day of forced busing in Boston. 18,000 students assigned to schools outside their neighborhoods to achieve racial balance. Black students from Roxbury bused to South Boston High. White students from South Boston bused to Roxbury schools. Federal Judge W. Arthur Garrity ordered it. Boston School Committee had illegally maintained segregated schools. Lower funding for black neighborhoods, separate and unequal. The solution was busing. The result was violence. Rocks thrown at school buses. White parents forming human chains to block black students. Police in riot gear, escorting children to class. September 9th. White mobs attack black students leaving South Boston High. October 7th. White students stab black student with American flag mounted on pole. Photographed. Published nationwide. By 1976, the crisis had metastasized, and the only lesson anyone learned was how to abandon the system entirely. Here's what was supposed to happen. Busing would integrate schools. Black and white students would attend the same classrooms. Equal resources, equal opportunity, equal outcomes. That was the theory. The reality was that integration required forcing children into hostile environments while their parents weaponized resistance. Boston Public Schools, 92,000 students in 1974, 85,000 in 1976. 7,000 students disappeared in 2 years. Not because of population decline, because white families pulled their kids out. Private schools, Catholic schools, moving to suburbs where busing orders didn't apply. This is called white flight, and it destroyed urban school systems faster than segregation ever did. But Boston wasn't unique. Louisville, Kentucky, September 1975. Court orders busing for 119,000 students. Largest system affected in the country. First week, violent protests. National Guard deployed. Buses attacked. Injuries on both sides. By June 1976, Louisville looked stable. Busing seemed to be working. But the numbers told a different story. White enrollment in Jefferson County Public Schools, 53% in 1975, 44% by 1980. 9% of white students gone in 5 years. They didn't disappear. They moved to counties where busing didn't exist, or enrolled in private academies that opened specifically to avoid integration. And this is where it turns. Because the courts could order busing within school districts, but they couldn't stop families from leaving those districts entirely. So white families with resources moved, and the school districts they left behind collapsed financially. Because here's how public schools are funded. Local property taxes. That's the primary source. 44% of school funding comes from local taxes in 1976. When property values are high, schools get more money per student. When families leave and property values fall, schools get less. This creates a permanent structural inequality. Rich neighborhoods fund excellent schools. Poor neighborhoods fund failing schools. And once that pattern locks in, it never reverses. 1973. Supreme Court rules in San Antonio Independent School District v. Rodriguez. Question: does funding schools through local property taxes violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment? Answer: no. 5-4 decision. The court says education is not a fundamental right under the Constitution. States can fund schools however they want, even if that creates massive inequality between rich and poor districts. And this ruling guarantees that busing will fail, because you can bus students to achieve racial balance. But if the school they're bused to is underfunded because the neighborhood is poor, integration doesn't create equal opportunity. It just moves kids between failing schools. By 1976, the pattern is clear. Urban schools are losing white students, losing property tax revenue, losing resources. Suburban schools are gaining white students, gaining property tax revenue, gaining resources, and the gap widens every year. Cleveland lost 28% of students between 1970 and 1980. Majority white flight. Detroit lost 41%. City schools became 90% black. Philadelphia lost 23%. These aren't just demographic shifts. They're the systematic dismantling of urban public education. And busing accelerated it, not because busing was wrong, but because white families had the resources to escape it, and the system let them. This is the generational divide that defines 1976. If you attended public school before 1970, you got functional integration or well-funded segregated schools. If you attended after 1976, you got underfunded chaos. Same cities, same school systems. Different outcomes based entirely on when you were born. And this is where the moral imbalance becomes permanent. The white families who fled to suburbs didn't just escape busing. They escaped the consequences of disinvestment. Their children attended schools funded by high property values. Meanwhile, the black families who stayed in cities watched school budgets collapse as property values fell and white residents left. Equal protection under the law meant nothing when one group could buy their way out of court orders. But here's what nobody calculated in 1976. When you destroy confidence in public schools, you create a permanent class system. Families with money opt out. Private schools, suburbs, better districts. Families without money stay trapped in the failing system. And the schools that serve poor families never recover. Because once funding is tied to property taxes, poverty becomes hereditary. Poor neighborhoods have low property values. Low property values generate less school funding. Less funding means worse education. Worse education means lower earnings for the next generation. Lower earnings mean they stay in poor neighborhoods. And the cycle repeats. Busing was supposed to break that cycle. Instead, it gave wealthy families an excuse to abandon the system entirely. 1976. Cleveland Public Schools spend $2,100 per student. Shaker Heights, the wealthy suburb next door, $4,300 per student. Double the funding. Same metro area, 10 miles apart. And that gap is legal, because property taxes fund schools, and Shaker Heights has higher property values. The Supreme Court said this is constitutional, and 40 years later, the gap is worse. 2016. Cleveland spends $11,000 per student. Shaker Heights, $18,000. The ratio hasn't changed. The dollar amounts increased, but the inequality stayed locked in. And it all became permanent in the 1970s, when white families discovered they could escape integration by moving to districts the courts couldn't touch. July 4th, 1976. Bicentennial celebrations across America. Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. Meanwhile, school systems in Boston, Louisville, Cleveland, Detroit, and Philadelphia are collapsing because families with resources are fleeing court-ordered equality. The promise and the reality couldn't be further apart. Equal education was supposed to be the foundation of American opportunity. Instead, 1976 revealed that education is the mechanism through which inequality becomes permanent. Your zip code determines your school. Your school determines your opportunities. Your opportunities determine your income. Your income determines your children's zip code. And the system calls this meritocracy. Busing didn't fail because integration was impossible. It failed because the system allowed those with resources to opt out. And once opting out became the norm, public education split into two tiers. One for families who could afford to leave. One for families who couldn't. Separate and unequal all over again. Just repackaged as school choice and property tax funding. The courts ordered integration. The suburbs delivered segregation with better branding. And by 1976, everyone understood the new rules. If you can afford to move, your children get good schools. If you can't, they don't. That's not a failure of busing. That's the system working exactly as designed. November 1975. New York City runs out of money. Not metaphorically, not in a budgetary sense. Literally out of cash to pay employees, maintain services, or make bond payments. Mayor Abraham Beame tells President Gerald Ford the city needs federal loan guarantees, or it will default. Ford's response, summarized by the New York Daily News. Ford to city, drop dead. The headline becomes legend. The sentiment was real. New York scrambles. Municipal Assistance Corporation created. Emergency loans. Brutal cuts. 40,000 city workers laid off. Transit fares doubled. Firehouses closed. Garbage collection reduced. Libraries shuttered. The city survives. Barely. But the crisis isn't about mismanagement. It's about suburban sprawl bleeding cities dry. And 1976 is the year that pattern becomes permanent. Here's what happened to American cities between 1950 and 1976. White residents left, not slowly, not gradually, massively. New York City lost 1 million white residents between 1950 and 1980. Philadelphia lost 400,000. Detroit lost 600,000. Chicago lost 800,000. They didn't disappear. They moved to suburbs. And when they left, they took the tax base with them. Because cities fund services through property taxes and income taxes. When property values fall and high earners leave, revenue collapses. But the infrastructure still needs maintenance. Police, fire, sanitation, schools. Cities became responsible for maintaining systems designed for larger populations while collecting taxes from shrinking, poorer populations. That's not a budget problem. That's structural insolvency, and this is where it turns. Because suburban sprawl wasn't accidental. It was federally subsidized. The Interstate Highway System, authorized 1956. 41,000 miles of highways connecting cities to new suburban developments. Federal funding, 90% of construction costs. States paid 10%. Local governments paid nothing. These highways didn't just connect places. They carved through urban neighborhoods, destroyed stable communities, displaced hundreds of thousands of residents, and they funneled white families out of cities into suburbs where property was cheap and taxes were low. This was policy, not market forces. The federal government spent hundreds of billions building roads that made suburban living possible while refusing to invest in urban infrastructure. But it gets worse. Federal Housing Administration mortgages. Available starting 1934. Low-interest loans for new home purchases. Government guaranteed, minimal down payment. Revolutionary program. Made homeownership accessible to millions. Except it excluded urban neighborhoods. FHA had maps, color-coded by neighborhood risk. Green, safe for investment, mostly white suburbs. Red, hazardous for investment, any neighborhood with black residents. This is called redlining, and it meant federal mortgage guarantees were available for white families buying suburban homes, but not available for anyone buying property in urban black neighborhoods. Capital flowed to suburbs, none to cities. Property values rose in suburbs, collapsed in cities. Wealth accumulated in white suburban communities, evaporated in urban black communities. And this was official government policy until 1968. By 1976, the damage was irreversible. Detroit population 1950, 1.8 million, 83% white. Detroit population 1980, 1.2 million, 34% white. 600,000 people left, almost entirely white and middle class. What remained? Poor black residents in a city designed for twice the population. Tax base collapsed. Services gutted. Infrastructure crumbling. And the suburbs surrounding Detroit thrived. Grosse Pointe, Birmingham, Bloomfield Hills. High property values, excellent schools, low crime. Built on the tax base that fled the city, but legally separate. Different jurisdictions. No responsibility for Detroit's collapse. This is where the moral imbalance locks in. The federal government subsidized suburban development with highways and mortgages, then abandoned cities when the tax base left. Detroit asked for federal assistance in 1975. Response: fix your own budget problems. But the federal government created those problems by building highways that emptied the city and guaranteeing mortgages in suburbs while redlining urban neighborhoods. The system created urban decay, then blamed cities for failing. And 50 years later, the pattern hasn't changed. Cities still struggle with infrastructure designed for larger populations. Suburbs still benefit from federal highway funding and mortgage subsidies. And everyone pretends this is natural market evolution instead of deliberate policy. But here's what nobody talks about. Suburban sprawl isn't sustainable. It only works if cities still exist to subsidize suburban infrastructure. Suburbs need water systems, sewage treatment, power grids, roads, All of it requires massive regional infrastructure that suburbs alone can't afford. So suburban communities rely on regional systems built and maintained by cities. But they don't pay city taxes. They incorporate as separate municipalities. Lower taxes, fewer services, minimal obligations. And when the infrastructure fails, they demand that cities fix it while contributing nothing. This is called extraction. Suburbs extract resources from urban systems while avoiding the costs of maintaining them. And cities collapse under the weight of infrastructure bills they can't afford because the people who benefit from those systems move to suburbs specifically to avoid paying for them. 1976. New York survives its fiscal crisis. Barely, but dozens of smaller cities don't. Cleveland defaults on municipal bonds in 1978. Youngstown, Gary, Camden, Newark. All of them follow the same pattern. Manufacturing jobs disappear. White residents flee. Tax base collapses. Services cut. Infrastructure decays. And the suburbs, built on highways carved through those cities, thrive. Because suburban residents commute into cities for jobs, use city infrastructure, benefit from urban services, then return to suburbs where their taxes fund excellent schools and parks instead of crumbling city infrastructure. One generation of white families got to leave. One generation of black families got left behind in the ruins. And the system calls this freedom of choice. July 4th, 1976. Bicentennial celebrations. Fireworks over New York Harbor while the city is still negotiating emergency loans to avoid bankruptcy. Parades in Philadelphia while white families continue fleeing to Montgomery County suburbs. Festivals in Detroit while the city loses 1,000 residents per week. The celebration was a performance. The reality was urban abandonment. And the suburbs built on that abandonment were celebrating too, because they'd successfully escaped the consequences of disinvestment they'd caused. This is what defines 1976, the year the two Americas became geographically permanent. One America, suburbs, wealth, opportunity, well-funded schools, low crime, high property values. Another America, cities, poverty, abandonment, failing schools, collapsing infrastructure, no investment, and a highway system connecting the two, built with federal money, carved through black neighborhoods, funneling white families out and resources away. The Declaration of Independence says all men are created equal. The suburbs created in the 1970s proved that geography determines destiny more than any inherent equality. Where you're born decides which America you live in. And the decision was made in 1976 when the last wave of white flight emptied cities and federal policy refused to stop it. The fireworks celebrated 200 years of American promise. The suburbs proved that promise was always conditional, available to those who could afford to move, denied to those who couldn't, and the distance between those two groups became measured in highway miles, built by the government, paid for by everyone, benefiting only those who could escape. 1976. Median family income, $14,960 per year. Average new house, $43,000. That's 2.8 times annual income. Put another way, a family earning the median wage could buy an average home with less than 3 years of income. Mortgage rates, 9%. High by historical standards, but still manageable. Monthly payment on a 30-year mortgage, $348. That's 28% of median monthly income. Affordable by the federal definition. Under 30% of income and achievable on a single salary. One working parent could support a family of 4, buy a house, own a car, save for retirement. This was the American dream in 1976. And it was the last year it worked. Here's what nobody tells you about that calculation. It only worked if you had access to the system. FHA mortgages, VA loans, conventional financing. All of it depended on property being located in neighborhoods banks considered safe investments, which meant white suburbs. Black families earning the same income couldn't get the same mortgages for homes in Redland neighborhoods. Latino families couldn't access the same financing. The affordability was real, but it wasn't universal. And this is where it turns. Because 1976 wasn't just the last year the American dream was affordable. It was the last year anyone pretended it was supposed to be available to everyone. Median family income in 1973, $15,440 in constant 1976 dollars. Median family income in 1976, $14,960. That's a decline. Not in nominal terms. In actual buying power, families were earning less in 1976 than they had 3 years earlier. And wages would keep falling relative to costs for the next 50 years. This is the peak, the high water mark of middle-class prosperity. From this point forward, everything gets more expensive and wages don't keep up. Housing costs balloon. College tuition explodes. Healthcare becomes unaffordable. But in 1976, none of that is visible yet. Families can still buy houses, still afford one car per parent, still send kids to state universities without catastrophic debt. It feels normal. It's already ending. But here's the structural break that guarantees it never comes back. Dual-income households become mandatory. In 1976, 51% of mothers with children under 18 worked outside the home. By 1990, 67%. By 2010, 71%. That's not liberation. That's economic necessity. Families needed 2 incomes to maintain the standard of living 1 income provided in 1976. And once 2-income families became the norm, housing prices adjusted upward. Because sellers set prices based on what buyers can afford. When buyers can afford more because both parents work, prices rise to meet that capacity. And single-income families get priced out entirely. This creates a ratchet effect. Once housing prices rise to match dual-income affordability, they don't fall when families revert to single incomes. They just become unaffordable, and the system never corrects. 1976. Average rent, $220 per month. 18% of median monthly income. Affordable, manageable, sustainable. College tuition at a state university, $600 per year. 4% of median family income. A student could work part-time during the school year and full-time in summer and graduate debt-free. Healthcare costs, $592 per capita per year. 4% of median individual income. Expensive, but not catastrophic. And this is the part they don't talk about. All 3 of those costs rose faster than wages for the next 50 years. Average rent today, $1,700 per month. 29% of median income. State university tuition today, $10,000 per year. 14% of median family income. Healthcare costs today, $13,000 per capita. 22% of median individual income. Every foundational cost of middle-class life doubled as a percentage of income between 1976 and 2026. And wages didn't keep up. But here's what makes it irreversible. The generation that bought houses in 1976 locked in their costs. Fixed-rate mortgages, 30 years. Payment never changes. Housing costs as a percentage of their income declined over time as wages rose. By the time they paid off mortgages in the 2000s, housing was functionally free. The generation trying to buy houses in 2026 faces the opposite situation. Houses cost 8 times median income instead of 3 times. Interest rates fluctuate. Down payments require years of savings. And once you're in, housing costs never decline as a percentage of income because wages don't rise fast enough. The system worked for one generation, and it locked the door behind them. This is the generational divide that defines everything after 1976. If you bought a house before 1980, you accumulated wealth. If you tried to buy after 1990, you accumulated debt. Same country, same system, different outcomes based entirely on when you were born. And the people who benefited don't understand why younger generations struggle. Because for them, the American dream worked. They bought houses on single incomes, paid for college with part-time jobs, retired with pensions. They did everything right, and it worked. So when younger generations say the system is broken, older generations hear excuses. But the system isn't broken. It's working exactly as designed. It delivered prosperity to one generation by extracting it from the next. July 4th, 1976. Bicentennial celebrations. Fireworks over a country that still believed the American dream was real. And technically, it was, for that year. For families who already had access to the system. For white suburban homeowners with stable manufacturing jobs and employer pensions. The dream worked, but it was the last time it would. Median income peaked in 1973. Housing affordability peaked in 1976. Single-income family viability ended in the 1980s. Pension availability collapsed in the 1990s. And by 2010, the American dream required 2 incomes, crushing debt, and 20 years of payments just to achieve what one income bought outright in 1976. This is what the Bicentennial was really celebrating. Not 200 years of continuous progress, but the peak of a 40-year expansion that was already ending. The generation that fought World War II came home to subsidized mortgages, union jobs, and rising wages. They built the largest middle class in human history. Then they handed their children an economy designed to extract wealth instead of build it. And by 1976, the extraction was already underway. Jobs disappearing to automation and outsourcing. Housing costs rising faster than incomes. Education becoming a debt trap instead of a ladder. Healthcare shifting from employer-provided to individually financed. All the foundations of middle-class stability were eroding. But the fireworks were loud enough that nobody noticed. The American dream didn't die in 1976. It was murdered by policy decisions that prioritized corporate profit over worker wages, by suburban sprawl that redistributed resources away from cities, by education funding tied to property taxes that locked in inequality, by healthcare costs that bankrupted families, by wage stagnation that turned dual incomes from choice into necessity, and by a generation of leaders who celebrated the Bicentennial while dismantling the systems that made prosperity possible. The fireworks were the funeral. The tall ships were the procession. And the promise buried that day was this: that hard work would be enough. It wasn't anymore. By 1976, the game had changed. You needed 2 incomes. Advanced degrees. No medical emergencies. No economic downturns. Perfect timing. Geographic luck. And even then, you might not make it. The American dream became a lottery. And the winners were the ones born early enough to buy in before the door closed. Everyone else got to watch from the outside, while the fireworks celebrated a promise that had already been broken. 1976. CEO to worker pay ratio, 28:1. That's the average chief executive at a major corporation, earning 28 times what a typical worker earns. High by historical standards, but comprehensible. A factory worker earning $15,000. A CEO earning $420,000. Different scale, same economy. Both depended on the company performing well. If the company collapsed, the CEO lost the job. The worker lost the job. Risk shared. That alignment ended in 1976. Not suddenly. Not with announcement. Quietly. to a shift in how companies measured success. And 50 years later, the ratio is 281 to 1. Not because CEOs worked 10 times harder, because they stopped being accountable to the same outcomes. Here's what changed. 1976. Corporate success measured by long-term growth, building products, serving customers, employing workers. Profit mattered, but it wasn't the only thing that mattered. Companies were embedded in communities. Executives lived near factories. Workers and management inhabited the same world. When a plant closed, everyone felt it. That's not morality, that's geography, and geography creates consequences. But corporations discovered they could decouple from geography entirely, move production overseas, close domestic plants, shift profits to financial markets. And the executives making those decisions never had to live in the towns they destroyed. This is where accountability breaks. 1978. Congress passes the Revenue Act of 1978. Buried in the legislation, Section 401k, tax-deferred retirement accounts. Employees contribute pre-tax income. Employers optionally match contributions. It's designed as a supplement to pensions, not a replacement. But companies see an opportunity. Defined benefit pensions cost money. Guaranteed payments for life. Corporate liability. 401k plans shift the risk. Employees manage their own investments. Market performance determines retirement income. If the market crashes, retirees lose savings, not the company's problem. By the 1990s, most corporations eliminate pensions entirely. Workers get 401k accounts, volatile, dependent on market timing, no guarantees. And this is where it turns. Because once retirement security depends on stock market performance, workers become invested in corporate profit maximization, even when that maximization comes at their expense. 1982, Securities and Exchange Commission changes the rules. Stock buybacks, previously restricted as market manipulation, are now legal under Rule 10b-18. Corporations can repurchase their own stock without penalty. This seems technical, boring, regulatory minutia. It changes everything. Because here's what a stock buyback does. Company buys its own shares, reduces shares outstanding. Earnings per share increase automatically without the company actually earning more. Stock price rises, shareholders profit. Executives holding stock options profit. Workers see nothing. In 1981, stock buybacks represented 3.6% of corporate net income. In 2007, 89%. Corporations stopped investing profits in research, development, or worker wages. They bought their own stock. And the executives who authorized those buybacks were compensated based on stock price. This creates a perfect loop. Executives approve buybacks. Stock price rises. Executive compensation rises. No productivity increase required. No innovation needed. No workers benefited. Just financial engineering that transfers wealth upward. But here's what makes it permanent. When corporate success is measured by stock price instead of production, geography stops mattering. A company can close a factory in Ohio, eliminate 5,000 jobs, and watch its stock price rise because labor costs dropped. The workers lose, the community loses. The tax base loses, but shareholders gain. Executives gain. And the people making those decisions don't live in Ohio. They live in suburbs hundreds of miles away, or different states entirely. Consequences flow downward, rewards flow upward, and the system never corrects because the people with power to change it benefit from it staying broken. This isn't a conspiracy. It didn't require coordination. It required changing the incentive structure. Once executive compensation shifted from salary to stock options, maximizing stock price became the only goal that mattered. And the fastest way to raise stock price isn't building better products. It's cutting costs. Labor is a cost. Wages are a cost. Pensions are a cost. Eliminate those costs, and stock price rises immediately. Executives get rewarded. Shareholders get rewarded. Workers get laid off. This is called shareholder primacy, and it became doctrine in the 1980s. Before that, corporations were understood to have multiple stakeholders: workers, communities, customers, shareholders. After that, only shareholders mattered, because shareholders could fire executives. Workers couldn't, and this is where risk becomes socialized. When a corporation fails, workers lose jobs, communities lose tax base, suppliers lose contracts, but executives walk away with severance packages worth millions. When the economy collapses, banks get bailouts, corporations get subsidies, markets get propped up by federal intervention. Workers get unemployment benefits that run out in 6 months. Risk flows downward, rescue flows upward. Profit is private, loss is public. This pattern repeats in every crisis. 2008 financial collapse. Banks bailed out. Executives keep bonuses. Homeowners foreclosed. 2020 pandemic. Corporations receive trillions in relief. Workers receive $1,200 checks. The pattern is consistent. Those with power to cause crises never bear the cost of resolving them. By 2024, CEO to worker pay ratio reaches 281 to 1, 10 times higher than 1976. Not because executives work 10 times harder, because the system stopped requiring them to share consequences. The CEO of a company that lays off 10,000 workers receives a performance bonus for improving margins. The workers laid off receive nothing except 6 weeks severance and advice to learn new skills. One group's failure is the other group's success, and the system was designed that way, not maliciously, structurally. Change the incentive, change the outcome, and once the outcome favors executives at the expense of workers, nobody with power to change it has reason to. This is what completes the pattern. Workers lost leverage through union decline and offshoring. Cities lost resources through white flight and suburban sprawl. Families lost affordability through wage stagnation and cost inflation. And institutions lost accountability through financialization and geographic decoupling. Every lever that could have reversed the damage was removed, not because anyone planned it, because each change made sense in isolation. Pensions are expensive. Switch to 401ks. Labor costs are high. Move production overseas. Stock price is stagnant. Buy back shares. Each decision logical. Each decision legal. And together, they built a system where consequences flow in one direction and rewards flow in the other. July 4th, 1976. Fireworks over New York Harbor, celebrating 200 years of shared prosperity and common purpose, while the mechanisms that enforced that sharing were being quietly dismantled. Not with legislation, not with announcements, with incentive changes that made selfishness rational and solidarity costly. By the time anyone noticed, the architecture was locked in. Executives compensated by stock price have no reason to pay higher wages. Corporations decoupled from geography have no reason to invest in communities. Financial markets rewarding short-term gains have no reason to prioritize long-term stability. And workers bearing all the risk have no power to demand it be shared. This wasn't a collapse. It was a transfer. Stability transferred from workers to markets. Risk transferred from executives to employees. Wealth transferred from communities to shareholders. And accountability transferred from institutions to individuals. The system didn't break. It was redesigned. And the people it was redesigned to benefit never had to live with the consequences of that design. They watched from boardrooms and suburbs, while the world they restructured fell apart for everyone else. Not because they were villains, because they didn't have to be. The incentives made cruelty profitable, and profit became the only measure of success. That's what the Bicentennial fireworks were really celebrating. Not 200 years of shared prosperity, but the last moment before prosperity became optional for the people who controlled it, and mandatory only for the people who couldn't.